Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, December 6th, 2025, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Wisconsin and a new announcement from the Democratic plaintiffs in the case seeking to overturn the state's congressional boundaries, now hoping to have a hearing as soon as December 15th. They want to have this as soon as possible because they say, quote, time is of the essence as the state of Wisconsin, and they note that if the maps are unconstitutional, that it must be enjoined and replaced sufficiently far in advance of the upcoming August 2026 congressional primaries to ensure time for a new map that comports with the Wisconsin Constitution to be selected. The decision to now rush forth this map comes as we hear news from the United States Supreme Court that gives Donald Trump a victory in their Texas map here that gave Republicans an additional 5 seats for the 2026 midterm elections. But the Democrats have been fighting quietly and publicly in a lot of states, but ones including like Wisconsin, where there is a state congressional map here that is quite lopsided in favor of the GOP. Republicans win about 6 out of the 8 total seats routinely in this state. But Democrats make the argument that this congressional map is unfair, that it blatantly violates gerrymandering laws, and that it is meant to be one that helps the Republican Party undeniably. And I don't think anyone can really argue with that, right? Republicans wrote this map. They had an expansive enough majority that they were able to, push past what was necessary in this, in terms of the state's constitution and in terms of the state's legislative control. Republicans had that advantage because Republicans gerrymandered the map to give them that advantage, to now draw more maps to give them that advantage. But the state Supreme Court has already struck down the legislative maps in Wisconsin. They already made that decision that it was, in fact, a Republican gerrymander. And so now Democrats are looking for the state Supreme Court to go even further, to make that decision around the congressional boundaries. Now, if this whole thing sounds like deja vu, it probably should, because in 2025, earlier on this year, the Wisconsin Supreme Court made an announcement that they would not be taking up the congressional redistricting lawsuit directly. It was brought to them at first stance. It was something that was brought forth to them by voters in Wisconsin, by legal groups in Wisconsin, and they didn't even take the case to begin with. And a lot of people were left puzzled, right? Democrats have the majority in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. They just spent tens of millions of dollars to win that race with Susan Crawford in April of 2025. And so they were wondering, okay, if Democrats have the majority, why is it that they would not hear this case? Now, Republicans were very quick to make the decision that, well, they don't want to hear it because they don't care. They're not beholden to Democrats on this issue because now that they're on the court, they can just run for re-election, and Democrats will have to vote for them anyway because there's no alternative besides a conservative justice, which nobody wants. But I think it gets even further than that, right? When we saw that this announcement was made, we made a video about it back in June, but you can actually read it here in the article. The very real answer here is that it's very possible that, the judges believe that it should be something that should be handled by the lower courts. And also, too, that this is something that the United States Supreme Court, looking over its shoulder and potentially overturning any ruling they make on the map guiding elections for federal lawmakers, they don't want that to happen, right? This is not something that they want to be done immediately. And so if they can defer to a lower court's decision, it could really be something that is brought up from the lower to the higher. And now we know that the Wisconsin Supreme Court is going to, in fact, take this case up in the way that they know well. They have already appointed a 3-judge panel to overview this decision here and overview the congressional gerrymander and make that decision and a recommendation to the state Supreme Court based on their findings. And so the point here to expedite the process, I think, is that one end, obviously, Democrats want a victory now in Wisconsin to try to mitigate some of the other losses that they are suffering across the country. As Missouri and North Carolina have now solidified their redraws in Indiana, that one's up for grabs on Monday. Right now in Florida, that one's also up for consideration as well for a mid-decade redraw ahead of 2026. But Wisconsin is one that if Democrats are able to usher in a fairer map, not only could Democrats be guaranteed an additional seat, axing out a Republican seat, but might be able to turn this map into one that has 2 toss-up Republican seats, 3 safe for the Democrats, 3 safe for the Republicans, and 2 seats that, right now are held by Republicans that could be toss-ups on the statewide level. Whereas right now there is only one real toss-up. It's Wisconsin's third, but it's still lopsided in favor of the GOP. If you look at it on the presidential level, Kamala Harris lost this district by 8 points in 2024. So, even in a year where Republicans are winning nationally by 2, this district is still quite conservative. And so the idea here, I think, for Democrats is to take a district like the 1st or the 3rd, make it safe for the Democrats, and then take districts like the 8th and the 1st, or the 8th and the 3rd, or the 3rd and the 1st, whatever combination might be, and turn them into districts that maybe tilt in favor of the GOP or maybe not, but are still toss-ups nonetheless, but still give Democrats that additional seat. And if Democrats are successful in lobbying the Supreme Court to, expedite this process and actually get the hearing as soon as, 9 days from today, it could put Democrats in a better position going into 2026, one knowing where they'll need to invest resources in, field strong candidates in, really hone in on, but simultaneously too, it just helps them on that front, right? They're working with districts, they're working with states, and they're ending up with results that show that sometimes if the state is favorable to the Democratic Party, they could ask and make it so their map here and their math here works for them on the congressional level in 2026 earlier on than before. And so, I think that the 2026 midterms have largely been defined by these court cases, by these state maps, and as much as we have had normal midterm elections on this channel, 2018, 2022, that have not been clouded up by, a president who is asking these state legislatures to draw the maps to save their party in 2026, as we are seeing now. We didn't even see that under Trump 1 in that first term. This is where you see cases like these actually end up being the most interesting because they could be quite substantial hits to the GOP because the precedent that is set here can also be applied elsewhere. Democrats also, I think, forget, and Republicans too, that they also have majorities in some state Supreme Courts that could allow them for changing of the maps again in some other states as well. For instance, there's a court case out in New York that no one seems to be tracking that argues that the Republican Party illegally, ended up with a map that violates representation for Black and brown communities in New York City. And so it makes that argument that New York's 11th district is a Republican gerrymander and also argues that this map here and the 11th district in its entirety is in fact unconstitutional. Now that is up in the air. There's no guarantee and no real argument that that's something that will land well amongst a state Supreme Court, but it is a Democratic-controlled state Supreme Court. And so if there was any court that would be willing to oblige with that argument and make that case, it's possible that a Democratic court could agree with that decision and thus throw maps like this one awry and make the change significantly too, because if one district has to be changed, so do surrounding districts, and then you can start to see the 6th district or the 4th district rather than 3rd district become more Democratic by nature, X, Y, and Z, all of these different things. Obviously no guarantee that that could happen, but it's something that Democrats are looking to. And they're looking to Wisconsin as that next court case that if they are again successful in getting this expedited, we could get a result on this as early as late December, early January, and that could end up being yet again another suffering defeat for Donald Trump and the GOP, but also something that shows Democrats are in a good position for 2026. And so we'll have to wait and see, right? Wisconsin, this is a waiting game as it is with every single court case. There's no real concrete timeline with much of it, besides the fact that there needs to be a decision on this sometime soon. And the recommendations, of course, are going to come late, right? The Wisconsin Supreme Court made the decision to even appoint this panel. They announced they were going to, but they only did it recently. And so everything has really been on delay, but very obviously, there's a truncated timeline because the midterms are less than 11 months away, right? And so we are working with, and I think the judges are too, this impending understanding that the deadline is approaching, that there's an August primary, which puts it at a later date than other states. So no guarantee as well that they even abide by this decision. And I don't even know if that means much for the sake of the case, if they're willing or not willing to expedite the process, because the Republican Party is obviously in opposition to an expedited process. They don't think it benefits them because they are counting on a loss here. And so they want to prolong it as long as possible. They also want to make the argument that if the Wisconsin State Supreme Court was to intervene too late in their eyes, they could make the argument to the United States Supreme Court and ask that they maintain the current map for 2026 and then rule on this in 2027 to make that decision because it's too early to change the maps, or rather too late to change the maps ahead of the midterm election. And there might be an appetite for that, right? And so I think the Democratic Party is just looking for something to get out now. So if there's any further legal battles, they have the time to argue the case before the courts, unless, these judges simply don't want it to pass and don't want this new map to be implemented, at which they will probably just rule against it. And there's no doubt that the United States Supreme Court would not be more favorable to the Democrats here. And so it would likely die in the Wisconsin Supreme Court if they were not able to get this done, one, on time, and two, in the way that the Democratic Party would want. And so we'll, again, play this waiting game with both sides of the aisle. They obviously see Wisconsin on the Republican side. They don't see this state as a gerrymander because it benefits them. Democrats obviously see it as a gerrymander. This is a state that's roughly 50-50 in terms of partisan control, so it doesn't really make sense that the majority is 6-2 constantly. I think the last time Democrats had a majority was in 2008, and that was with Obama winning the state by double digits, and even then, 2 years later, Democrats lost it in 2010. And since then, even in 2012, Democrats won the statewide Senate election too. Didn't matter. Republicans won the majority. In 2016 rather, it was 50-50. Trump had the narrow upper hand. Republicans took that to their advantage in 2018 as well. And then after 2020, they drew a gerrymander, slightly altered this Wisconsin 3rd District to make it more favorable to the Democrats, but also to Ron Kind made the decision to retire. This race is held on to the GOP, but Democrats would obviously want a more favorable map because it would give them an additional seat. And if they are successful in lobbying for that, you could end up with the House map here that is 4-4 for the Democrats, or if they get the 2 swing seats that they want, given it's a 2026 midterm, could be back to a majority for the first time since Barack Obama's first election. Again, this is all up in the air. This is all hypothetical, but if it happens, I'm sure Democrats would be very thrilled about the status of their state so far, because Wisconsin, as a state that is 50-50, routinely sends more Republicans than Democrats to Washington, D.C., and that might finally change. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.